Welcome. We are so glad you've joined us for today's event. I'm Melissa Grover-Morrow, Vice President of Impact and Special Initiatives at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. I'm going to get some housekeeping out of the way first. So lunch is in the adjacent room. Make sure that you get your drinks and your food as you need to. And we do have a packed agenda today. So and a relatively short time together. So make sure that you get up when you need to. Restrooms are downstairs. There are signs guiding you as needed. For those of you who are new to Washington Center for Equitable Growth, we bridge economic evidence and policy to promote ideas around shared prosperity and growth in the US. We do this by funding research, elevating academic voices in the policy world, and translating academic evidence for policymakers. Much empirical work has been done by academics on populism in the US and abroad. We are hosting this event today to bring the empirical evidence from multiple disciplines together and ensure that the evidence is used to shape future economic policy in ways that strengthen democracy. Today's event also serves as our official launch of an essay series we published on the causes of rising support for populism and potential solutions aimed at strengthening democracy. Many of the essay authors are with us today, and you'll be President and CEO Sherrod Brown.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sherrod Brown, and I'm the President and CEO of the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. I'm sorry I'm not here with you in person for this important event today, but I'm so excited for our great lineup of programming and for the opportunity for discussion. Around the globe, people are increasingly dissatisfied with politics and the economy. In the United States and other rich democracies, economic policy has in recent decades too often produced rising economic inequality, stagnant economic growth and innovation, rising costs of housing, healthcare, and education, greater economic insecurity, and declining job quality and stability. Voters have communicated their frustration with a surge of support for populist parties, politicians, and political causes that challenge incumbent elites and profess to speak directly to the needs of real people. In most cases to date, voters have gravitated to populism's right-wing or authoritarian variants. There has been, and will continue to be, a lot of punditry about the 2024 US presidential election in particular and what it means. What Equitable Growth is trying to do is what we do best: bring academic evidence to bear on important policy conversations. We hope to draw on learnings from other countries as well as the US and use concrete evidence to chart a better path forward, one that leads to equitable economic growth that people can feel and that gives them hope for the future. Our specific goal in this event, this essay series, and other essays on this topic that we will publish in the future is to explore the implications of right-wing populism for those making and following US economic policy. In our discussions today, we will lay out the case for why policymakers should approach economic policy with an eye to its political effects on democracy, as well as exploring what this approach could look like across different policy areas. We believe that the turn towards authoritarian populism in the United States not only threatens democratic institutions and systems, but also puts Americans' economic well-being at risk. Economic policy can work to counteract this trend and bolster US democracy, but is less likely to do so as it has traditionally been developed. At a time when the broader policy community is still debating the implications of the 2024 presidential election results and the extent to which it was a referendum on former President Joe Biden's economic policies, we hope that this event and essay series will broaden the debate about the future of economic policy and politics in the United States at a moment of democratic crisis. Enjoy the event today, and I look forward to being part of the discussions and debates that follow.
With her well on her leave, I'd now like to introduce Alexander Hurdle Fernandez. Alex is an associate professor of international and public affairs at Columbia University, where he serves as vice dean and is also a visiting fellow with Equitable Growth. Alex is a co-director of the Columbia Labor Lab, which uses social science to study worker power, and a co-lead of the Consortium on the American Political Economy. During the Biden-Harris administration, he served in the U.S. Department of Labor and the White House Office of Management and Budget. His research focuses on the politics of markets, policy design, and labor and the workplace. And Alex has worked side by side with me in designing today's event and providing vision and support for the essay series. Alex?
Thanks so much, Melissa, and thanks so much to all of you for coming out on a rainy day to listen to the fantastic set of ideas and essays that we're launching here. It's been a real privilege to be able to work together with Melissa and the EG team over the past 6 months to solicit and edit such a great set of ideas and essays from political scientists and economists and sociologists that, as Shana mentioned, really tries to lay out the case for why economic policy needs to take democracy seriously and can't just focus on economic outcomes. We're really excited to share 9 of those essays with you today, and you'll see on your table a QR code that you can scan to download those essays, and I encourage you to do it after the event today or in some downtime. As Shana mentioned, these essays really take a variety of forms. Some of them focus on diagnosing the drivers of right-wing populism and thinking about how different economic policy choices have increased the appeal of right-wing populism in the US and other countries, and others propose new policy ideas that could be used to diffuse or defang the appeal of right-wing populism. And you'll hear about some of those today, whether it's new ways to measure economic sentiment, new ways to organize grassroots constituencies so that they see the role of government in their lives, or new ways to invest in places that can really reinforce senses of community and belonging. In addition, Shana and I released an introductory essay for this project that reviews our overall goals, reviews the existing state of the literature on economic policy and right-wing populism, and comes up with a framework for how policymakers going forward might think about applying these concepts to their own work. And I wanted to share 3 of the moves that we try and make in that introductory essay that I hope resonate through the panels today. First, and most importantly, we argue that the surge in support for right-wing populism here in the United States and around the world needs to be taken seriously by thinkers and doers in the economic policy space. This isn't just a political problem for pundits and strategists, but one that economic policy needs to grapple with. Second, we argue that to do that will require drawing on a broader set of disciplines in social science than have traditionally been applied to economic policy. They're not just economics, although we have some fantastic pieces from economists in our series, but also thinking about political scientists and sociologists who have been thinking about this. And the last move that we stress that policymakers and others should undertake is thinking about putting the US in a comparative context. Far too often, we think about the ways that the US is exceptional from other countries, and in many cases it is, but thinking about right-wing populism orients us to the ways that this has really been a shift around the globe across many rich democracies. And as we think about the causes, consequences, and ways to defang right-wing populism, we really need to be focusing on that comparative context. So building on those insights and the great essays that we've commissioned, Shana and I propose new criteria for making economic policy. That policy needs to take seriously people's lived experiences of the economy, that it needs to take seriously people's identities, their sense of narratives about their lives, especially around dignity and status, place and community, and needs to show clearly how government is responding in real time to people's perceived social and economic needs. So I encourage you to check out the introductory essay and the fantastic essays that have been released today and will be released in the coming months. Now, to help frame this discussion, we are so fortunate to have 2 leaders who have, for many years, been thinking about how economic policy can support democracy in the workplace and in politics. They're also 2 personal heroes of mine, so it's a real treat to be able to introduce them and be in conversation with them. First, we'll hear from the Honorable Sherrod Brown, a former Democratic US Senator from Ohio. Brown spent his life fighting for the dignity of work, which, as we'll discuss, is a key factor in understanding how to diffuse the appeal of right-wing populism. And the Honorable Sherrod Brown, over this lifetime of public service, has very much focused on these questions. In March of this year, he launched the Dignity of Work Institute, an organization dedicated to people who make this country work and to creating an economy where Americans' work is valued. Next, we'll be in conversation with Sarah Nelson, who is the International President of the Association of Flight Attendants, a role that she's held since 2014. As International President, Nelson has led the association through some of its most important wins, including relief during the COVID pandemic that kept aviation workers connected to their jobs, while also capping executive compensation during the crisis. Nelson has also been a leading voice within the labor movement calling for large-scale organizing, especially of young people, and of gender equity in the workplace and in unions. And very relevant to this project, she's also thought and written trenchantly about the relationship between unions and democracy. So please join me in welcoming our keynote speakers, starting with former Senator Sherrod Brown.
Thank you. Alex, thank you for your kind words. It was good seeing you with Freedom Together a few weeks ago. My longtime friend, Sarah Nelson, thank you for standing up and speaking out the way you do. Melissa, thank you too for joining us. I'll start with this. I don't see populism as a dirty word. I see it as the way forward. When I talk about populism, as I think probably all of you in the audience do, I mean real populism. True populism lifts people up, all people. It doesn't play to race. It doesn't play to division. It doesn't tear people down. A true populism in the most affirming forward way is about the dignity of work, putting workers at the center, listening to workers. If you actually listen to workers, what's happening isn't really that complicated or mysterious. We have an economy today that does not reward work, that does not value the work of Americans without four-year college degrees, and in many cases doesn't value the work of Americans with four-year college degrees, where people can't keep up with the cost of living no matter how hard they work. Over the past 40 years, corporate profits have soared, executive salaries have exploded, stock buybacks, bonuses, productivity keeps going up, yet wages are largely flat. The cost of living keeps getting more expensive. Productivity and wages through the 60s and 70s, 80s, maybe even into the 90s, productivity and wages used to rise together. That began to change in the late 70s. Since then, workers produce more and more, but they enjoy a smaller and smaller share of the wealth they create. Cost of living just keeps going up. People don't have enough money coming in the door. They have too much money going out the door. And be clear, a couple of years of modestly rising wages are not going to make up for decades of Americans working harder than ever and less to show for it. Let me tell a story that I was at an AFL-CIO dinner in Cincinnati some years ago, and as politicians do, I was walking around table to table talking to people, and there was a table near the front, 6 middle-aged women, and there's an empty chair, and one of them said, "Sit down for a second." And I said, "What brings you here?" And they said, "We negotiated our first contract today, union contract." I said, "What was it?" She said, "We represent 1,200 custodial workers." She was kinder than the way I'm going to say it. Essentially, they work all night at low wages to clean the offices so people like me can come into work the next day. And I said, "What's this contract, first contract we've had for these 1,200 workers? What's this contract mean to you?" And she said, "This is the first time in my life. I'm 51 years old. This is the first time in my life I'll have a paid 1-week vacation." Most people in Ohio, certainly people like her, but most people in Ohio believe the system's rigged against them. And they're right. I trace a lot of this back to NAFTA. The attitudes on display there have infected so much thinking about the economy in Washington. It was my first year in Congress in 1993. I led the opposition among the 60 Democrats in the freshman class. I was talking to Bill Richardson, a veteran Democrat at that time, part of leadership, who was one of the leaders in the support for NAFTA movement in Congress. And he said to me, he said, "Brownie," nobody called me Brownie but him. He said, "Brownie, I hate these congressional recesses because every time our members go home, they come back more opposed to NAFTA." And I said, "Yeah, there's a reason for that. People don't like this direction that you want to go in." Today in the Mahoning Valley, Youngstown, Warren, Eastern Ohio, not far from Pittsburgh, not far from where the train derailed, the Norfolk Southern train derailed, I still hear about NAFTA. There was and still is a visceral sense of betrayal that the party of Roosevelt had sold out their communities. I understand Republicans, Bush negotiated, Republicans voted for it in larger numbers than Democrats, but they expected better from Democrats who talk about workers and talk about what we need to do. And I was during this NAFTA fight, I learned a lot about where this country is going and where workers, how underrepresented workers are during that debate many years ago. But I remember someone told me there were more corporate jets at National Airport during the week of the NAFTA vote than they had ever seen. That should tell us something too. They then, the Wall Street, the free traders in Congress and the business community, meaning most of them, they followed up NAFTA with something with normalizing trade relations with China. They fairly unbelievably, they initially called it most favored nation status with China. They realized that didn't quite work, so they changed the name. But there was little debate among the supposed serious economists. If you point out that a flood of Chinese imports would cost us manufacturing jobs, and understand what this was. It's companies in places like I grew up, Mansfield, Ohio, an industrial town where I went to school with hundreds of sons and daughters of steelworkers and auto workers and millwrights and iron workers and bricklayers and electrical workers. And those companies started to move south to anti-union states and always in search of lower wages. And then they came to Congress and pushed for these trade agreements, understanding shut down production in Lima or Shelby, Ohio, move to China, pay much lower, always in search of lower wages, pay lower wages, weaker environmental laws, fewer worker protections. So that's how we got to where they were. But when you point out that a flood of Chinese imports would cost us manufacturing jobs, they'd say the labor market, I remember this word, it will adjust, whatever that means. Talk to anyone in a manufacturing town in the Midwest or elsewhere. They'll tell you this was lunacy. Of course, people lost faith in the party. They probably lost faith in populism and progressivism, and they lost faith in their government. They feel gaslit. They feel condescended to. Leaders in both parties said these deals would lift everyone up, and they looked down on anyone who disagreed. I remember campaigning with one national Democrat near Cleveland. In between events, the conversation turned to trade, and he said, "Sherrod, you're fighting the last war." And I also heard comments like, "You're on the wrong side of history." Anytime you raised a concern about workers, they'd say, don't worry, we'll compensate the losers. That was a term, that some activists will say that TAA, trade adjustment assistance, is sort of is burial expenses. I mean, that's what people that were so opposed to these trade agreements thought. They seem to have no awareness. The pushers of these trade agreements seem to have no awareness of how insulting all this sounded. As if any amount of compensation could replace the dignity you get from a good paying middle class job with the skills you're proud of. You make things, you build things, you keep these plants going because of your skills as a bricklayer or a millwright or an electrician or a plumber or a pipe fitter. The leaders of both parties have missed this, not just on trade, but on the entire project that often gets called neoliberalism. We've allowed the financial industry, we've allowed multinational corporations to run wild. Essentially, we've let Wall Street run this economy, the financialization of the economy. Progressive response has largely been, we'll just try to do enough to redistribution and taxes and spending to make up for the way it hurts workers. We weren't able to do that, of course, not even close. But beyond that, the solution is unpopular, and frankly, it's insulting to workers. Too often, people in Washington end up sounding like they think workers in the heartland are charity cases. But most people don't want what they view as government handouts, nor do they want to be left to fend for themselves in an unfair market rigged, that word again, rigged by multinational corporations that benefits people at the top. They want a level playing field so their hard work can actually pay off, so they can afford a decent life. That brings me to what Alex said, the Dignity of Work Institute. Early this year, a group of us that used to work in my office and supporters and people in the labor movement and others launched the Dignity of Work Institute in Ohio. It's a national organization. It'll be headquartered in Ohio. It's nonpartisan. It's nonprofit. It's dedicated to create an economy where workers benefit from the wealth they create. They share in the wealth they create. It's actually making workers the winners in our economy. Research will be a big part of this work. We began with a national survey asking Americans about their jobs and their lives. Not a political discussion, but a worker-centered discussion, how they view success and the barriers they see to getting ahead. We followed that up with national focus groups with a broad cross-section of the country. You'll be hearing more about this soon. From all of this, it's so clear that the way people in Washington measure and talk about the economy is just wrong-headed. It's fundamentally flawed. It doesn't reflect the reality of workers' lives. President after president in both parties tout how great the economy is. They cite the unemployment rate, they cite the inflation rate, they cite the stock market, but those statistics don't come close to telling the whole story. Working multiple jobs is a way of life for a lot of workers. It's how low workers' expectations have gotten about the economy. 1 in 4 workers have worked more than one job in the last 2 years. So the unemployment rate hardly tells that story. In every focus group, people talked about driving Uber or Lyft or doing Instacart, not necessarily even in a negative way. They see it as a safety net to keep up with costs. Again, more money going out than money coming in. Fewer than half of Americans, get this, fewer than half of Americans say they could deal with fairly comfortably an unexpected $1,000 increase. That's replacing 4 tires on your car, the car you need to get to work or to do work. And that could be an unexpected expense that workers just would have great difficulty dealing with. A low unemployment rate or inflation rate coming down doesn't mean nearly as much to people as people in Washington want to believe if Americans have to work 2 jobs to afford to live. One project we're undertaking is pushing progressives like all of you to come up with new, better ways to measure the economy. We can't make the mistake again of cheerleading for an economy that people rightly think is failing. People want fundamental change. This may have been the most interesting information of the survey. We asked people on a ladder, 1 to 10, which rung are you on? If it's 1, if you pick 1, you're satisfied with the economy, things are working. 10, you want to blow everything up and tear it all down and start again. Overall, half said 8, 9, or 10. And a third said 10 out of 10. That's why Trump's destruction with the way he does things is appealing to a lot of people in this country. Workers keep telling us the status quo isn't working for them. That was clear last year. It's why we got the election results we did. Workers wanted change in 16. They voted for change. Workers wanted change in 20. They voted for change. Workers wanted change in 24. They wanted change. I know a lot of people in this room were involved in the Biden administration. High hopes for what they could deliver. But for all the legislating and policy making over the last 4 years, Americans didn't see this administration as a break from the status quo. They saw the White House and progressives as defenders of institutions that people believe fundamentally have failed them. And they're not wrong. That's so clear with inflation. To people in Ohio, it seemed the White House was oblivious to what they were seeing in their own lives, or worse, trying to deny the very real price increases that were killing them every time they went to the grocery store. Connie and I, after church, would often stop in a grocery store nearby, and we would hear people at the checkout counter, in the aisles, at the meat counter, a checkout line, the meat counter, in the grocery store aisles, talking about inflation, and they weren't really buying, oh, it's higher in other countries. They weren't really buying that it's coming down. They didn't buy the term transitory. I mean, who comes up with lines like that? It's the same kind of tone deafness people in Ohio heard for years on trade. It's the mentality of, we in Washington know better. You just don't understand how great it is what we're doing. People essentially wanted a wrecking ball to the system. Trump is a wrecking ball, but he's not wrecking the things that stand in the way of progress for workers. People think it's so clear what people think. They think the economy is getting worse, not better. They think costs are going up, not down. They're worried about tariffs, which are giving tariffs a bad name. They can be done right and giving new life to the old corporate consensus on trade. It's not either Trump's way of doing tariffs or going back to the neoliberal way that we've practiced trade in this country, because that surely didn't work. So people are looking around and saying, when's my life going to start getting better? Where's the wrecking ball for for corporate interests that still raise prices? Where's the wrecking ball for Wall Street or the drug companies that built system that reward CEOs instead of workers? They think that right now, neither party has an agenda to create the dramatic change workers want. Fundamentally, they're not wrong about that either. This is a project the progressive movement has to undertake if it wants to include workers without college degrees, workers who didn't go to fancy schools, workers who don't live, and no offense intended here, but workers who don't live in Washington or New York or San Francisco. We have to start with listening. That's why at our institute, we're not starting with a series of policy prescriptions. I know what I think, but I want to know what workers think. We're hearing directly from workers in polling and focus groups and roundtables and discussions about their lives and the economy they want to see and how to get there. We need to make workers the winners in our economy. That's what my mission is. It's what the Dignity of Work Institute is all about. It's what the progressive movement needs to fully commit to, fundamentally, that workers share in the wealth they create. Thank you so much for having me.